Good morning. I'm going to invite you to try something with me this morning. You can do it as much as you're willing and able. I'm going to describe it first, and then we will all try it together. Okay? I am going to ask you to take a deep breath and hold it for 30 seconds. All right? Think you can do that? I've got to find my way to my timer here. Are you ready? Breathe. Exhale. Breathe again. I want to reflect a little bit on what we just did together. First thing to note is that my experience was probably not exactly like your experience, but there was probably a lot that was the same about that. Even if you didn't hold your breath for the entire 30 seconds, you still probably got a little bit of an idea of what that feels like. 30 seconds is not an amazingly long time to hold your breath. Probably long enough that you noticed it. Maybe even kind of started to worry about when that time was going to be up. And maybe it's different for you sitting out there in the congregation, but for me to stand up here on the chancel for 30 seconds without doing anything, not singing, not praying, not anything, feels like a long time. And I use that as an illustration. That's the best way I could figure out how to illustrate the idea of solitude in a group of people. The concept of solitude is not difficult to grasp. The purpose is not complicated, but if you're anything like me, it's difficult to do. It doesn't necessarily come naturally. So this morning I want to talk about solitude, the biblical concept and where we find it in the Bible, in the life of Jesus, why it might be important, and encourage you to try this practice during Lent. What we won't be able to do in worship this morning is to give you a chance to share your own experience. But I hope you will get the chance to do that in your deacon groups, which will be meeting in the next week or so. Our text from Mark 1 is one of the places in the Gospels that tells how Jesus went off to a deserted place by himself to pray. And as we said last week, Mark is the shortest of the four Gospels, so the narrative clicks right along. But this happens in Mark chapter 1, just a few paragraphs away from our text from last week where we talked about Jesus' baptism and temptation in the desert. Jesus is a busy guy in the first chapter of Mark. Matthew and Luke tell us that he was alone in the desert when he was tempted and give us some more detail about that. But Mark blasts right through that. In Mark 1, Jesus is baptized, tempted, begins his ministry, calls his disciples, casts out an unclean spirit, heals the sick of an entire city, heals a leper, and makes the religious leaders mad. All in the first chapter. Okay? About 3/4 of the way through that chapter, verse 35 says, "In the morning, while it was still very dark, he went out to a deserted place where he prayed." Now, it's interesting that Jesus would do this when there was so much to do and so many people who needed him. He'd been up late the night before because when the Sabbath ended at sundown, the whole city gathered at his door. That is how Mark says it. The whole city gathered at his door and brought all of those who were sick or possessed by demons. Can you imagine what that would look like, looking out your door at sundown? When the disciples hunt Jesus down at daybreak the next morning, they say, "Everyone is searching for you." Yeah, I bet. If you have ever been in a position of being responsible for taking care of another person or other people day in and day out, you have a little sense of the weight which was on Jesus' shoulders. If you've cared for young children, aging parents, a spouse who's ill, patients, clients, emergency situations where you're responsible for somebody else's physical or mental health, it's all exhausting work. It's exhausting ministry. People needed Jesus all the time. We know that at other times in Jesus' ministry, especially after his last meal with his disciples and immediately before his arrest and trial and crucifixion, Jesus went off to a quiet place to pray. Solitude and prayer at times of intense stress and pressure are the bookends at the beginning and the end of Jesus' ministry. That fact all by itself would make it worth paying attention to, and maybe even trying for ourselves. I'm going to make a distinction between solitude and simply being alone. Many of us are alone by ourselves at home, in the car, maybe even the place where we work on a regular basis. This is not always our choice. If you are single because of death or divorce, there's probably some grief in that time alone. Folks who are introverts might enjoy having some time alone, but very few of us choose to be alone all the time. That's different from what I'm calling solitude. Here are a couple things that are different. Solitude is a much rarer commodity than being alone because solitude takes intention on our part. It's increasingly easy to be plugged in all the time, maybe even in multiple ways at the same time. We have the TV on, the radio on, and our phones close at hand. And of course, we need to keep up with what our children are doing, what our parents are doing, what our relatives are doing, what our friends are doing, and what people we don't even know are doing, right? Often, when my husband Tim and I are watching the news, he is reading the news on his phone while we're watching the news. Or at least he tells me he's reading the news. Solitude means unplugging from those things for a set amount of time. Last week I talked about Celtic Christian practices and that they came from a culture which engaged God in the world rather than withdrawing from the world to find God. What I'm encouraging us to do with solitude is not to withdraw from the world, but to include God as one of those places where we connect. To make God important enough that we set aside other things to connect with God. And although I would call solitude a kind of prayer, it's not the kind of prayer that we might usually associate with prayer. It is not holding up friends or family members in prayer who have health needs or concerns. It isn't even strictly listening for God. It is simply being in the presence of God. It's a way of acknowledging in the midst of our busy lives or our empty lives or our grieving lives or our joyful lives or our lives which are a complex combination of all of those things. It's a way of saying that our lives are more than just our lives. Solitude is a way to acknowledge that God is important enough to us to simply pause and be in God's presence. I'm not going to tell you how to do this. There are some specific suggestions in the Lenten booklets. I encourage you to read those and see if they work for you. I recognize that everyone's commitments and schedules and temperaments are different. Remember, spiritual practices aren't competitive. The goal is to find something that works for you and can deepen your relationship with God and help you to be strengthened in your walk with Christ. If you find something that works with you, for you, and you want to share it to help someone else along the way, that is how we support one another. So in that spirit, I want to share some things with you that I have learned along the way. I have shared some of these before. If you were paying close enough attention that you still remember them, God bless you. But I'm going to repeat it because it's still the same. I did not begin a regular practice of prayer and solitude until I had to do it for a seminary assignment. I had to commit to a certain amount of time regularly and keep a log of that time. And I found this much more difficult than reading or writing papers because there were no shortcuts. I could not say the assignment was to sit for 15 minutes, but I'm going to power through and get it done in 10. Not only does it not work that way, I do not have a natural aptitude for solitude. Hardly anyone does. When I sit still and try to clear my mind for any period of time, my mind, which is pretty unruly, immediately starts making lists of what I need to do as soon as this quiet time is over. And you have probably experienced that the harder you try not to think about something, then it's impossible not to think about it. So here are some things that I have learned for myself. I make the list beforehand, so it is outside of my head. And I put prayer on the list. I have some external physical things that help me as well because I'm a person that likes stuff. So I sit in the same chair, in the same place. I have an oil lamp that I light. I have a prayer shawl that I put around my shoulders. I have a cat who thinks that anytime I am sitting down and have a lap available, that is an invitation for attention. And that cat used to distract me until I realized I could take that same enthusiasm and desire to be loved and use it as an image for my own relationship with God. Now, you might think that's silly. Doesn't matter. Everybody's different how they approach this stuff. We come to God in the context of who we are. What I'm suggesting is that if you haven't tried solitude, or if you haven't tried it recently, see what works for you and be patient with yourself if you're not successful immediately. It takes effort. Investing in nothing can take a lot of effort. Another word here as we close. Solitude does not turn us into someone else. If you're an extrovert, it won't make you into an introvert. If you're a busy person, it won't turn you into a lazy one. No spiritual practice turns us into someone else. That is not the goal of spiritual practices. Spiritual practices can, however, help us see ourselves the way God sees us. They remind us why Jesus claims us as beloved. My conviction is that for each of us, no matter our personality, temperament, or experience, being comfortable alone with yourself is a gift. It's not a gift which we can give ourselves. It's a gift that is freely given by the grace of God. Grace is free, but we still have to accept it. Sometimes the most difficult person to tolerate and accept and forgive is ourselves. We may even keep ourselves busy doing in order to avoid the fear of being, and the fear of being ridiculed or rejected, or of other people seeing us as someone besides who we try and present ourselves to be. There is nothing we can do to make God love us more. There is nothing we can do to make God love us less. With grace, we can see ourselves the way God sees us and hope for the same things that God wants for us. I pray that we will know that promise and accept that grace in Jesus Christ. Amen.